The dust was the worst of it. It wasn't the heat that choked him, nor the agonizing ache in his useless legs, but the fine, gritty red powder that filtered through the roof tiles and settled on his eyelids, tasting like forgotten promises. Eleazar lay on his mat, paralyzed in both body and soul, staring upward into the blinding midday sun filtered through the makeshift hole his friends were tearing into the ceiling of a house in Capernaum. The noise was deafening. The snap of dried mud, the scrape of broken timbers, the shouted curses rising from the packed crowd below. But Eleazar barely registered the chaos. His paralysis, the affliction that had rendered his lower body cold and heavy for 3 miserable years, felt secondary to the true malady. The absolute, crushing weight of despair that had been settling over him for far longer. He was a man drowning not in water, but in the thick, slow current of his own guilt. Before his legs failed, his spirit had failed. He had been a man of influence, a respected trader known for the sharpness of his intellect and the rigidity of his moral code. A code he had shattered in a moment of arrogance and greed, resulting in the ruin of a business partner and the starvation of that man's family. The weight of that sin, that unforgivable error, was the true chain binding him to this filthy mat. He didn't deserve healing. He deserved the dust and the decay. He was allowing his friends to commit an act of monumental public disruption and blasphemy, destroying a man's roof, violating the sanctity of the home, all to drag a piece of rotting meat, which was all he felt he was before a controversial rabbi. He closed his eyes, wishing the ropes would snap, wishing the whole ceiling would collapse and end this humiliating spectacle. His friends, bless their foolish, relentless hearts. For men whose loyalty was the last remaining evidence that maybe, just maybe, not all grace had abandoned the earth, had insisted. They had hoisted him up, mat and all, outside stairs slick with sweat, driven by a stubborn hope that Eleazar himself could not feel. He didn't want to walk, he wanted oblivion. Walking would simply mean returning to the world where his failure lived, a world where the sun still shone on the faces of the people he had wronged. What good was working legs if the core of your being was still a mass of festering regret? The rope burned against his shoulder as the final structural beams gave way, and the gap widened. For the first time in 3 years, the sheer, open sky looked down on him, and with terrifying certainty, he realized he was about to be dropped into the very presence of a man rumored to see into the depths of a soul. He was about to be exposed, physically lowered into the spotlight of judgment, carrying nothing but his despair and his paralyzing sin. The descent began, a terrifying, jarring process that momentarily jolted Eleazar out of his internal misery and forced him to confront the immediate, present danger. The ropes bit deep into the hands of his 4 friends, Jehiel, the massive fisherman who refused to speak of failure, Amos, the quick-witted scribe who kept reminding Eleazar that even broken inkwells could hold truth, and the twins, Reuben and Shimon, whose combined silent strength was the engine of this desperate act. They lowered him slowly, the mat swaying precariously, dust raining down like a reddish judgment onto the unsuspecting audience below. Eleazar could hear the sudden crescendo of gasps and outraged murmurs as the light above intensified and the massive gap in the roof became undeniable. He heard the metallic scrape of the rope against the wood beam and felt the sickening lurch as he slipped a few inches. He saw the faces of the crowd swim into focus, distorted by the angle and the anxiety. Faces of skepticism, faces of piety, and the horrified faces of the house owner and his family. The entire room, packed shoulder to shoulder with people straining to hear the rabbi, was now looking up at the dangling man. It was the most vulnerable moment of his life, worse than his sickness, worse than his ruin. His paralysis had previously given him anonymity and distance. Now he was the center of an ugly, chaotic stage. He realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that this was the very essence of his condition. Complete powerlessness, requiring others to manage his existence, forcing him to rely on the dangerous kindness of men. Eleazar hated it. He hated the pity in the eyes of the women, the cold judgment in the eyes of the Pharisees seated near the front, and most of all, the determined sweat on the brows of his friends above. They were risking their own reputations, perhaps even legal action, for a man who felt utterly unredeemable. As the mat finally settled with a soft thud onto the stone floor directly in front of the teacher, the silence that fell upon the room was absolute, heavy, and profound. Eleazar, lying prone, could not raise his head, but his eyes fixed immediately upon the dusty sandals of the man who stood before him. They were the sandals of a poor man, worn from many roads, yet they seemed to radiate a stillness that defied the chaos they had just generated. He waited for the inevitable lecture, the stern reprimand for the damage to the property, or the simple command to heal. Instead, he simply felt a gaze, a steady, patient, almost amused gaze, piercing through the darkness that had shielded his soul for years. He knew instantaneously that this man didn't see a paralyzed man. He saw the lie Eleazar had been living, the guilt that had calcified into hopelessness, the secret shame that had robbed him of the will to rise long before his muscles gave way. The moment Eleazar's eyes met the eyes of the teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, the world seemed to contract into that small, dust-filled space. The noise of the protesting crowd, the anxious shuffling of the disciples, and the low, simmering indignation of the scribes seated nearby faded into an inconsequential hum. What Eleazar saw in those eyes was not pity nor judgment, but an immediate, radical understanding. It was the comprehension of a physician who diagnoses the root cause of an illness before the patient has even articulated the symptoms. Eleazar had come seeking a physical cure, a restoration of his limbs so he could cease being a burden, but Jesus looked beyond the limbs, straight into the cavernous, desolate geography of his soul. The teacher was not shocked by the destruction of the roof. He was simply observing the extraordinary lengths to which human desperation and human loyalty would go. Jesus looked first not at Eleazar, but upward, to the four strained faces peering down through the jagged hole, and a faint smile touched his lips, a smile of approval and recognition for the faith displayed by the friends. That was the key, Eleazar realized with a jolt of confusion. The teacher was acknowledging the faith of others, not Eleazar's own desperate resignation. Then Jesus looked back down, fully engaging the broken man on the floor. Eleazar felt the need to apologize, to explain the sin that had brought him low, but his throat was too dry, sealed shut by the years of silence and self-loathing. He wanted to confess, to purge the poison, but all that escaped his lips was a strained, wheezing cough, stirring the dust around his mat. The onlookers were poised, ready for the spectacular display of power, the wave of the hand, the majestic command. The Pharisees, with their scrolls resting primly in their laps, were ready to record the methodology, perhaps hoping for a misstep, a theological error in the healing process. They were prepared for magic, but Jesus was preparing to offer something far more subversive and infinitely more terrifying to the legalistic mind. Eleazar's chest tightened, anticipating the moment of truth. He expected the teacher to say, "Rise up, Eleazar, and walk," thereby acknowledging the mat as the seat of his problem. But the teacher did not address the mat, nor the legs, nor the paralysis itself. He addressed the silent, invisible prison Eleazar had built around himself, the prison of hopelessness born of unforgiven sin. The air crackled with anticipation, and Eleazar braced himself for the physical examination. Instead, the words came, gentle yet carrying the seismic power of creation itself, aimed not at the body, but at the desolate heart. The expectation of the entire room was monumental, a swift, clean miracle. The physical sight of the paralyzed man, filthy and helpless, laid bare the need for immediate action. Everyone in the room, from the most devout follower to the most skeptical critic, was focused entirely on the potential for Eleazar's legs to straighten. They were primed for a public demonstration of physical power, a cure that would validate the teacher's authority through empirical evidence. Eleazar himself, despite his profound spiritual darkness, still harbored a faint, primitive desire for his muscles to simply obey him again, to stand, to walk away from the shame. But Jesus, operating on an entirely different plane of reality, understood that if Eleazar's soul remained crippled by the unforgiven past, even fully functioning legs would only carry him faster into deeper despair. Physical healing without spiritual restoration is merely a temporary reprieve, a beautifully decorated cage. Jesus saw that Eleazar's deepest, most life-draining affliction was not the palsy, but the crushing burden of guilt that made him fundamentally unwilling to participate in life, convinced he deserved nothing but his present misery. He had internalized the belief that his failure was greater than any possible grace. This realization made the moment heavy, almost unbearable. The crowd wanted spectacle. Eleazar needed salvation. The silence stretched, a taut string ready to snap. The scent of sweat, ancient oil lamps, and pulverized gypsum hung thick in the air. The Pharisees subtly adjusted their robes, their posture conveying a judgmental impatience. Eleazar felt a rising heat of shame in his face, knowing he was delaying the teacher's lesson. Why didn't he just say the words? Why prolong this exposure? Then Jesus spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like polished obsidian. He didn't boom, he didn't dramatically gesture. He simply spoke, looking directly into Eleazar's defeated eyes, acknowledging the man's identity and status before addressing his condition. The words were a direct counterpoint to Eleazar's deepest fear, a shattering of the narrative he had clung to for years, the narrative that insisted he was forever stained and beyond repair. This was not the expected command for physical movement. This was a declaration of internal war against the very concept of hopelessness, aiming directly at the psychological paralysis that had preceded the physical one. The true miracle was about to be revealed, and it had nothing to do with muscle fibers or nerve endings. It had everything to do with the infinite, reckless audacity of divine grace confronting human condemnation. Then the words came. 3 specific words, gentle yet impossibly heavy, which landed in the crowded room like a declaration of war against the entrenched religious order and the very concept of permanent human failure. Jesus looked down at the man, Eleazar, whose eyes were still fixed on the ground in self-contempt, and he said, "Thy sins forgiven." These were the words that conquered hopelessness, shattering the core belief Eleazar held, that his past was irreparable and that his spiritual debt was too large for redemption. They were the 3 words that signaled the ultimate radical freedom. The reaction in the room was immediate and violent, though confined mostly to the intellectual chambers of the religious elite. A visible shockwave ran through the seated scribes and Pharisees. They did not shout. They seethed. Their minds raced with unspoken accusations, their faces hardening into masks of controlled fury. Blasphemy! How dare this mere man usurp the authority that belongs to God alone? Only God can forgive sins. By uttering those 3 words, Jesus had not merely offered Eleazar comfort. He had claimed divinity, challenging the entire foundation of their priesthood and their rigid legal system. Eleazar, however, experienced the words not as theology, but as a physical, visceral release. It was as if a heavy stone, lodged in his chest for years, suddenly vaporized. The immediate, suffocating fear of eternal accountability dissolved. Tears, hot and unexpected, streamed down his dusty cheeks. He felt a lightness that transcended his physical paralysis. His soul had been unbound, set free from the spiritual prison he himself had built. But the spiritual struggle was only half the battle. Now came the test of belief. The scribes, bound by their rules, believed the spiritual healing was impossible for a man to administer, whereas the physical healing was simply a difficult feat of nature. They murmured, calculating their response, their silent verdict ringing louder than any shout. Who is this man who speaks blasphemy? This internal conflict in the room, the battle between grace and law, was precisely where the modern struggle lies when we face depression. We believe our condition is real, but we struggle to believe we are truly free from the guilt that caused it. This brings us to a crucial question that I want you to consider deeply. When you face despair, do you find it harder to believe in the possibility of physical change, a better job, a miracle cure, a solved problem? Or is it harder to truly accept that you are internally forgiven and free from the weight of your past failures? Where does your true struggle lie? In the practical world, or in the spiritual realm of acceptance? Share your thoughts below. Jesus, the master storyteller, the ultimate healer, had perfectly orchestrated this moment. He had diagnosed Eleazar's despair, treated the spiritual root with the shocking balm of unconditional forgiveness, And now, he was about to confront the intellectual rigidity of the opposition, using the physical miracle not as the primary goal, but as proof of the primary goal's successful execution. The collective mental gasp of the scribes was palpable. Their indignation, though whispered internally, radiated through the packed room, creating a tense, hostile atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the profound, quiet relief washing over Eleazar. Jesus didn't need to hear their specific words. He knew the content of their hearts, the cold calculus of their theological objections. This man blasphemes. Their belief system required complex sacrifice and priestly intervention for the remission of sins. This itinerant rabbi was offering it freely, unilaterally, and instantaneously, based solely on the faith of the man's friends and the broken humility of the man himself. It was a scandal to their meticulous faith. Jesus turned his gaze from Eleazar to the Pharisees, his eyes sharp and unwavering, a knowing challenge etched onto his face. "Why do you question these things in your hearts?" he asked, his voice calm, yet carrying the force of undeniable truth. He was exposing the ultimate hypocrisy. They were focusing on the mechanics of healing, trying to trap him in a legalistic argument, when the greatest need, the man's soul, had already been addressed. Then came the famous, clarifying question, the logical pivot that shattered their intellectual fortress. Which is easier, to say to the paralyzed man, "Thy sins be forgiven," or to say, "Arise, take up your mat and walk"? The question hung there impossibly heavy. From a human perspective, forgiving sins is metaphysically easier because it requires no physical demonstration. It is an invisible act. To command a crippled man to stand and then watch him do it is empirical proof, verifiable by every eye in the room. But Jesus reversed the spiritual and physical difficulty. Forgiving sins is the higher authority, requiring divine power. Healing the body is merely the visible, temporary confirmation of that power. Jesus used the physical impossibility, healing the cripple, as proof that he had accomplished the spiritual impossibility, forgiving the unforgivable. He was demonstrating that the source of true hopelessness, the paralyzing weight of guilt, could be utterly eradicated, and the proof was about to stand before them. This intellectual confrontation was necessary because Eleazar's hopelessness was deeply intertwined with the religious dogma that taught him his failure was permanent. Jesus was not just healing a man. He was dismantling the structure of shame that held men captive. He was showing the scribes and the world that his authority extended far beyond the visible realm, right into the deepest, darkest chambers of the human heart where true hopelessness resides. The 3 words had done the heavy lifting. Now, the physical command would confirm the spiritual reality. The tension reached its breaking point, waiting for the final, definitive act. Having silenced the mental accusations of the scribes by exposing their flawed logic, Jesus completed the astonishing transaction. He turned back to Eleazar, who was still weeping silently with the shocking realization of his radical forgiveness. Eleazar's chest still felt light, but his legs remained heavy, dormant. His spiritual freedom had been declared, but his body remained chained to the mat. Now, the validation was due, the physical evidence that the spiritual reality was true and tangible. Jesus leaned forward slightly, his gaze compelling Eleazar to finally look up, not in shame, but in expectation. The final command was issued, clear and unwavering, resonating with an authority that seemed to pull the very atoms of Eleazar's limbs into alignment. "I say to you, arise, take up your mat, and go to your house." The shift was instantaneous, not a gradual warming or tingling, but a sudden, violent influx of life. It was as if a long-dead river, blocked by years of debris and sludge, suddenly burst through the dam. Muscle memory, dormant nerves, and cold blood rushed back into his lower body with a fierce, burning energy. Eleazar gasped, a sound lost in the sudden, collective roar of the crowd. He felt the absolute, undeniable power of choice return, the ability to will his body to move, an experience he had forgotten entirely. He didn't have to struggle or try, he simply knew he could stand. The years of atrophy, the weight of the mat, the physical impossibility, none of it mattered. The command was absolute, requiring not effort but simple, immediate obedience. He pushed his hands down against the stone floor, his newly awakened arms straining, and then, with a clumsy, powerful surge, he brought his knees beneath him. He was standing. He looked down at his own legs, solid and real, legs that were suddenly his again. The crowd erupted into shouts, a sound of awe and astonishment that shook the very foundations of the house. The scribes were frozen, their careful arguments annihilated by the sight of the impossible made real. Eleazar stood swaying slightly, breathing deeply the air of a newly resurrected man. The initial euphoria of standing gave way to a deeper, more profound realization. The physical healing was merely the proof. The true miracle, the one that annihilated his years of crushing depression, had happened with those three shocking words, "Thy sins forgiven." He had been set free internally first, and the body followed the soul's liberation. The command had not simply been arise and walk, but a triple instruction, the final element of which held immense symbolic weight. Arise, take up your mat, and go to your house. Eleazar, still trembling slightly as the blood rushed through his revitalized veins, knew instinctively that this third part, take up your mat, was not just an afterthought. His mat was his prison, his identity, the symbol of his helplessness and his shame. It was where he had lain for years, inhaling dust and despair. To leave it behind would be to deny his history. To carry it was to transform it into a trophy of redemption. Slowly, reverently, Eleazar bent down, the action easy, fluid, perfect. He reached for the woven mat, now smelling strongly of illness, dust, and old sweat. As he bundled it up, tucking the filthy edges under his arm, the object itself felt lighter than air, no longer a symbol of bondage, but a banner of freedom. He clutched it tightly, recognizing it as the tangible evidence of the despair he had just conquered. He was not just healed. He was a living witness to a transaction far greater than physical recovery. His depression, rooted in guilt, had been vanquished by an external declaration of forgiveness, and the mat was the proof he carried against the inevitable return of doubt. He moved toward the door, every step a deliberate act of worship, walking through the path that had been instantly cleared by the stunned, murmuring crowd. The scribes and Pharisees, now utterly defeated, simply watched in silent, cold disbelief. Eleazar's movement was powerful, purposeful, imbued with a grace that came not from athletic training, but from a renewed soul. The light outside the door, the same midday sun that had previously felt like a searing judgment, now felt like a warm, beckoning promise. He exited the cramped, dusty house and stepped into the vibrant noise and color of Capernaum. The people outside, who had only heard the rumors and the shouts, watched him emerge. A man walking, carrying his own bed, and they broke into pandemonium, shouting praises, not just for the miracle, but for the power that had been demonstrated. Eleazar held his mat tight and continued walking, determined to reach his house, the place he had abandoned to his despair. The road was still dusty, the burden of life was still real, but he was walking toward it now, not crawling away from it. The journey home was a walk of internal reckoning, solidifying the monumental truth that he was, indeed, forgiven. The journey back to his own house was the true test of Eleazar's transformation. It was one thing to stand healed in the presence of the teacher. It was another entirely to carry that healing back into the messy, complicated reality of his former life. His house represented his failure, the place where he had succumbed to greed and where the paralyzing weight of his sin had first manifested. Now, walking with the rolled mat under his arm, every step was a defiance against the hopelessness he had once embraced. He walked past the stalls of his former competitors, past the homes of the men he had slighted, and past the dwelling of the family he had ruined. The physical strength was real, but the profound shift was internal. He possessed a courage he hadn't known since his youth. The three words, "Thy sins forgiven," had stripped away the source of his profound, paralyzing depression. He realized that hopelessness wasn't the absence of good things. It was the absolute conviction that you are fundamentally unworthy of them, that your history defines your future. By radical forgiveness, Jesus had given him a blank slate, the right to start over, the permission to exist without the suffocating blanket of past mistakes. This spiritual liberation was the engine of his physical movement. Without it, he knew he would simply regress, perhaps finding a new mat to lie upon, paralyzed by a new set of circumstances. He understood that true healing was not about the absence of problems, but the eradication of the belief that those problems were permanent evidence of divine abandonment. He finally arrived at his door, recognizing the familiar scent of old cedar and the silent weight of emptiness that permeated the structure. He pushed the door open, not as a desperate, broken supplicant, but as a man who had received the ultimate inheritance. The house was dusty, just like the floor in Capernaum, but now the dust felt manageable, something to be swept away, not something to surrender to. He carefully unrolled the mat, not to lie upon it, but to look at it, a reminder of the pit from which he had been lifted. The weight of his past life remained, but the paralyzing shame did not. He had been given not merely legs to walk, but the spiritual foundation to face the consequences of his actions with integrity and grace. He knew the work wasn't over. He would need to seek out the family he had wronged, make restitution, and rebuild his life brick by painful brick. But for the first time in years, the prospect of that hard work didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a purpose. The 3 words had not cured his depression instantly, but they had violently annihilated its root, the false belief that he was permanently separated from grace. The impact of Eleazar's healing rippled throughout Capernaum, serving as a powerful, unavoidable testament to the authority of Jesus. But the true, enduring parable lay in the priority of the cure. The people marveled at the physical miracle. "We have never seen anything like this," they praised God, astonished that a man could walk after years of paralysis. Yet, the deeper, more profound truth was that Jesus deliberately prioritized the internal freedom. He addressed the soul's crippling burden, the spiritual despair, before he addressed the physical symptom. He knew that the most dangerous form of human despair, the kind that leads to complete paralysis and hopelessness, is rooted in the conviction of unforgiven failure. If Jesus had only said, "Arise and walk," Eleazar would have gained temporary physical mobility, but the underlying psychological and spiritual chains would have remained. He would have eventually been haunted back onto a mat, paralyzed not by nerve damage, but by renewed guilt and a lack of purpose. The enduring lesson of this encounter is this: when we feel utterly defeated, when the weight of our losses or failures paralyzes our will to act, a condition we recognize today as profound depression and hopelessness, the cure begins not with fixing the external circumstances, but with accepting the radical, immediate forgiveness offered for the internal fault. Jesus' response to Eleazar's desperate condition was a direct answer to the modern epidemic of despair. He showed that the pathway out of deep hopelessness starts with the annihilating realization that your worst mistake, your deepest shame, and your heaviest guilt, "Thy sins forgiven," is already nullified. It is wiped clean. This knowledge is what unlocks the will, restores the courage, and gives the body permission to stand and move forward. The 3 words of forgiveness were the key that unlocked not only Eleazar's muscles but his entire future. They were the true conquest of depression, proving that no human failure, however devastating, is larger than the limitless reach of divine grace. The 3 words taught Eleazar that his identity was not defined by his mat, nor his sin, but by the overwhelming, unearned favor shown to him in that dusty, crowded room. He was a man freed from his past, given a future, and entrusted with a story of radical redemption. His life became a living sermon, proving that the greatest authority is the one that can reach into the deepest pit of the soul and declare, "You are worthy of a new beginning, not because of what you did, but because of what has been done for you."